both will be on the topic of how to finish the year strong. And there's one main component that we're thinking about when we're talking about what it means to finish the year strong. And that's really how do you set up next year's officers for success? How do you make them, in the best possible position for next year? First, obviously, you have to have new officers incoming. And so first thing first are your officer elections. If you haven't had them already, the TBP Constitution does require annual officer elections. Some chapters do them more often than annual, but at least once a year, you have to hold an election to elect new officers. Make sure you actually do the election. Don't just turn off the lights and walk away. If you are having trouble finding new officers to fill all the positions, we have had a panel recently on this very topic, and we'll send out this link along with some other links in an email later this week. So you can, take a look at that and watch that video if you're looking for more ideas on officer recruitment. Anyway, a big thing that is often missed with officer elections is your advisors. So your chapter should have 4 advisors, and usually every year at least one of their term is expiring. They're usually done in 4-year terms and staggered, so that's usually just one. But check your advisors' terms, and if any are expiring, then you have a choice to make. You could either have the chapter hold a vote on renewing their term for another 4-year term, or you could try to find a new advisor to elect to take over that slot in your advisors. Anyway, once your elections are done, you're required to complete the officer election report. This is a report that is used to notify headquarters of the names and contact information of the new officers who are going to take over. This is how headquarters knows who's to contact in your chapter. So if you do not complete this report, then basically TBP no longer has the ability to communicate with your chapter, which is, obviously horrible. So don't let that happen. Make sure you complete this. This is due within 2 weeks of your officer election, and it's completed with the online reporting system that you use for everything else, like the initiation process. In the report, you identify your incoming president, vice president, treasurer, and corresponding and recording secretaries, and any additions or changes to advisors. I've highlighted the advisor part again, because that's quite often forgotten, is that you have to pay attention to your advisor's terms as well. Also involved in the officer election report is the officer signatures report, which is found using the Upload Officer Signatures button on the officer menu. If you click that button, there will be a link where you can download it and then have the relevant people sign it. You're required to have the president, corresponding secretary, treasurer, and chief advisor all sign it in, and then make a scan of it so that you have a digital copy and you can just upload it directly into the officer election report. This is what the officer election report looks like. So it's right in here, the modify advisor portion, that you want to make sure to click on that and check your advisor's terms using that and make any adjustments as needed. But besides that, it's just mostly filling in, this is the person who's going to be president, this is the person who's going to be treasurer, and so on. Yeah, and it's through the menu that you get to this that you can get your officer signatures for. Anyway, once you have your incoming officers, you should be thinking about how to do your officer transition to flip it, flip the control of the chapter over to them and make sure that they're prepared for it. So if you haven't already started your officer transition, start now. And that applies even if you haven't elected your officers yet. Think of different ways to get people involved. Maybe, open your officer meetings to those who are interested in becoming an officer, and get that process started as early as possible so that that information can be transferred to them. But from the Chapter Development Committee, one big thing we want you to focus on is don't let your transition just be, here's my number, call me when you have a problem. You want to make sure that your transition actually prepares the new officers to take over. A few suggestions for this: if you have guides, tips, lessons learned, something like that, just some simple documents. They don't have to be super thorough, I really like the idea of just, here's 5 things I wish I knew at the start of the year, and you just have it on a paper and you hand it over to them. That's going to have them better equipped for the position than you were when you started it. So in my opinion, it's so easy to do and worth it. So that's one idea. Another, if you have documents throughout the year, such as whatever you use to take like attendance or keep track of membership, finances, posters for events, all these things. If you haven't already made some kind of Google Drive or have some kind of Google Drive or OneDrive, whatever works for you, with all those documents, we highly recommend you do and pass it on to the new officers so that they're not starting from scratch on these things. And we also recommend giving those new officers some kind of suggested sense of direction. For example, maybe you'd say, well, we feel like our membership is increasing quite well recently, but our member participation in our events is not where we want it. So I think that might be a good idea for you to focus on next year, or maybe on finances or something like that. Just some idea of where they should take their chapter so that they're not just starting off, not exactly knowing what to do with their chapter. We also recommend getting your advisors involved. You should definitely introduce them to the new officers. And if you can, as a group, go over how the past year went for the chapter and how it could be improved next year. Those things are huge. It lets the advisors and the new officers start to build a relationship with each other, which is really important, that they feel comfortable to contact each other when they need anything from each other. And it also helps get everyone on the same page in terms of what the goal and what the drive for next year might be. Back to why it matters, when I said, how do you set up next year's officers for success? A corollary I'm going to add for that is, don't leave them with any messes to clean up. If you give them any of your messes, anything that's unresolved from this year, it's just going to be something that holds them back next year, right? Or makes their jobs and lives more difficult. So one of the biggest messes that we often see left for the new officers is that there's several end of year reports that are all due by June 1st. And usually the transition has already happened by this point. And, quite often the officers simply just dump these on the new officers. And the big problem behind this, besides it's kind of a jerk move, but besides that, all of these, or multiple of these reports, almost all of them, require knowledge from the previous year. So like the financial report requires knowledge of the chapter's finances from the past year. Project reports require knowledge of the events that were run this past year, and so on. And so when you dump it on them, they're not going to have the necessary information to actually fill out these reports, and it's going to reflect poorly on the chapter. And again, it's kind of a jerk move because it's just handing them a bunch of stuff that they're not qualified to do right now. It's a much better idea if you can have the current officers and the incoming officers do these together, especially the incoming president and past president, so that they can do it together, get the necessary information there. And then if you make it a trend, like a annual theme for the chapter that they always do it together, then it will be passed down through the years and it will always get done. Some other things to wrap up. You want to make sure that your spring initiation process is completely done, that the initiation fees were paid and sent to headquarters, that the final action report and the rulebook signatures were submitted to headquarters, and that there's a plan in place for the keys, certificates, and cards from initiation. If your chapter has not already received those, you want to make sure that someone knows that they're going to receive them and that they need to get them to all the people that were initiated that term. Going back to finances, you also need to make sure that any outstanding debt or payments to headquarters are fully paid. And then also within this will vary depending on your college, but some universities and colleges, you might have some relationship between your chapter and the student government, and you want to make sure that any required steps in terms of contact, in terms of who's in control of the financial accounts, things like that, you want to make sure that those are taken care of. And then another, relatively big thing is a lot of chapters do orders of graduation regalia. So talking about like stoles, tassel cords, these right here. Depending on the chapter, some chapters just have members order them for themselves using the TBP Store. Other chapters order them in bulk. If your chapter is one that orders them in bulk, make sure that that order is taken care of and that the necessary materials got to the people who ordered them, and so on and so forth. If your chapter doesn't order these in bulk, just an idea to toss in your head, but you can use these as basically rewards to members who are active and participating in your events by discounting the stoles, tassel, and cords, or even just straight up covering for them if you can, if your chapter is endowed enough. And you can ask headquarters to prevent members from your chapter ordering them directly from headquarters, so that anyone at your school has to go through you to get them. So just a heads up on that. Those were the main things that I had in terms of how to set them up for success, and some messes that I want to make sure you avoid handing off. We're going to send out an email with the highlights video of this presentation, along with these links. I highly recommend checking out the SAB's Guide to Officer Transitions if you need more info on that topic in particular. We'll also send out the link for the chapter orders for the graduation regalia. If you haven't made that order yet and you need to, we'll send out that link. And then one more resource is the TBP Officer's Handbook, which is also made by the Student Advisory Board. And it's a good resource for you to look at, but it's also a great resource to hand over to the new officers as part of your officer transition. So highly recommend checking out those as well.
But I think the one thing I would add is for incoming officers for next year, I think it's really important to gather your officer board before the end of the year all together, and don't invite the old officers unless you want to, but I would suggest not to, in case there was tension or just different, different things that went on with the old board. And plus you need to like grow your own roots and get your own feel for your board. So I think in this meeting, you sort of want to make sure that everyone knows what their position is, make sure they have the contact info of the previous officer. And then maybe in that process, you'll discover you didn't have everything that you thought you did. So it's good to track that down before the old officers leave. So that's like point one for the meeting. And then point two, if you have any goals or directions that you want for the next year, it's good to establish that before summer hits so that people have that in their heads and they've just been elected officers, they're excited. So maybe if they want to, they can like get stuff together over the summer. Not saying they have to. I know I kind of fell off over the summers, but it's good to get that direction planted early before the school year starts.
And he stole the words goals out of my mouth. I think that's especially important if you were particularly in charge of like a chapter or part of a chapter that like turned itself around over the course of the last year. And, you got yourself out of a ditch and now you're like, we're looking to do awesome things with this new momentum that we've gained. Goals are really important. So if you write them down, then the next group can pass that along and make that actually reality like you had anticipated that it would eventually become. So that's definitely important. The other thing that I wanted to touch on was for new officers, if you can have a meeting before the one that Annie mentioned, where you just have all the new people, if you have a meeting with the old ones too, like during your, this could be during your transition or it could be different from it, where you sit down and you're like, hey, new people, you guys have no idea what's going on. So before we poison the well with all the terrible, like with everything that went wrong last year, what did you feel like? What do you think could be improved from your perspective coming in? And you'll be very surprised to see all the new ideas that people come up with. you might notice a pain point that you didn't notice before because you were, in the weeds and behind the scenes. And so you didn't really know how that was coming across to candidates and members. And so having those new people actually voice those concerns and be willing to voice those concerns without being afraid to is really important. And it helps establish that sort of, we're all in this together. We want to make this better, that sort of vibe overall. And if possible, invite your advisors to that so that they can get an idea of what other people are thinking out, as they join and become officers and all that stuff. So they can be acquainted with your goals and where you want to go with that. Oh, so yeah, there are actually, I know a lot of chapters, at least my district, who do that or who used to do that. I mean, before COVID was an entirely different scenario altogether, so that might be why. But they would do December elections for officers, and then the new officers would come aboard and their titles would be like president-elect, VP-elect, something similar. And they would essentially just shadow the outgoing positions so that they got up to speed with things quicker. And there was less of a slowdown later, in the fall semester when everyone started. So normally what happens is you come on as a new officer, and fall or, the first 2 quarters or whatever is just you trying to figure out what's going on and not, die from all of this incoming information that you have no idea anything about, right? And so that doing those transitions early, electing early, and then doing the transitions early and having this shadow period allows you to sort of get past that fall slump where you're just trying to learn, and that learning process comes earlier so that you can spend a full year actually doing things that you want to do and improving things you want to improve, as opposed to learning the ropes and trying to figure out how everything works. So you make those mistakes early while you have supervision, as opposed to later when, everything is happening and also you don't have anybody to rely on. So it doesn't have to be December. I know a bunch of schools that also do it in like January, February, or like only do the last couple of months. So like I know a few that are doing it in March, like early March. And so it's really up to you how you want to go about that process and how you want to make sure it keeps going for future use. But it's an option and an opportunity for anybody who's like, we want to be go, 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 and we don't want to have this learning curve when new people join.
Like, it's awesome if you can do that, but I know for a lot of chapters, especially the smaller ones, you're kind of relying on the spring initiation to get you the new officers. And then in that case, like, you probably aren't going to be able to fill your positions before then. And in those cases, I think if you can at least elect your president, so that they can go through at least part of the initiation process and see how it's done. And if they can help run the initiation ceremony, that's actually huge, because especially for a smaller chapter, the ceremony might actually be the most complicated event each year that they run. So I think that's really helpful if you can at least select your president before the initiation ceremony. And then if you could elect one more person before then and start that transition early, I would say it would probably be the treasurer, because dealing with the chapter's finances for a lot of chapters, maybe not all, but a lot of chapters, that might not be the most simple thing. If you have to interact with your student government or the dean's office, or or a bank or whatever for your finances, that might actually be one of the more complicated parts of running your chapter. So I think those two positions are probably the top two. Definitely the president, especially if the president at your chapter is the main one running the initiation process. That's huge if you can get them involved early. But for a lot of the others, like if you have a social media coordinator, I don't think it's huge for them to start super early. So it's kind of up to you and your personal taste.
My chapters were more like yours, Alan. I would say with the president, okay, so my chapters had elections like April, so pretty much at the end of the school year, before initiations. But I would say if you're looking, I think it's important to nail down a president, even if your election is late. Just having somebody or somebody's thinking about the president position before the election happens, I think is important. So they can sort of start getting the gears turning in their brain, like thinking about ideas for the chapter, or just like making sure that they're ready to take on the position, I think is important, because you do not want that position to be unfilled.
A great way if you're struggling with getting people is to do officer elections right after initiation. So if you have initiation, do it the same day when everyone's in the room. So you finish the ceremony, you got members and candidates there. And now you do right after you do officer elections so that any random person that just been initiated can still be like, if they're interested, they can just do it and run. So if you're looking for like trying to grab a couple people at the last minute, that's a great way to do it.
It's also like the best, as long as the people who ran the initiation ceremony did it right, it's kind of an inspirational moment if it's done
exactly.
well. And so like people are in the proper mood to become more involved with the chapter at that point.